Alright, welcome back to our Cryengine tutorial video set. In this video, I'm going to talk about the flow graph, and I'm going to give another example as to how you can make something happen in your scene. The example I'm going to do is I'm going to have an AI enter a vehicle and then drive the vehicle from one location to another. So the three things that I need to start with in my viewport are going to be an AI, a vehicle, and a path for it to follow. So I'm going to start out with my database viewer. And the best place to find the AI, which we talked about in one of the previous videos, is this Crynet Ops library. So I've already loaded that one. And the best place to find the vehicles that AI can drive is down here at the bottom in this vehicles.xml. And I've already loaded that one as well. So here in my drop-down list, you can see I have my Crynet Ops folder and I have my vehicles folder here. So I'm going to go ahead and find an AI to drive my vehicle. And again, I'll just go with one of the first ones. And I'll drag and drop them onto the viewport. And then I'm going to go with a vehicle. I'm going to use one of these armored cars. I'll drag and drop that onto my map as well. So once I have one of each of those, I'm ready to place my path. So over here on my roll-up bar, under the Objects tab, I'm going to go to AI. And one of my options under AI is AI Path. We talked a little bit about this in a previous video, but just as a review, to place an AI path, I'm going to make sure that my Follow Terrain button is clicked up here at the top. And then I'm going to go ahead and click once in front of my vehicle. It brings up this little path editor. And I can continue to click to place waypoints along this path. And one of the difficult things to figure out is that at the end of the path, when you're done placing your path, in order to stop the path editor, you double click. And I think I said it last time, but that took me a while to figure out. So now I have my AI, my vehicle, and my path placed. So we're ready to open up the flow graph. So I'm going to open View Pane and Flow Graph. So in my flow graph, I'm going to go ahead and create a new flow graph. And because I want this to start at the beginning of the scene, I'm going to go ahead and add my start node, which is found in the game category. All right. The next node I'm going to need, because I'm using a vehicle, I'm going to need an entity ID node. And this is basically just a placeholder in the graph for the vehicle. So what I'm going to do is going to add node, entity, and then entity ID. And you'll see how that works in just a minute. I'm going to go ahead and finish adding the rest of my nodes. The next node I'm going to need is a vehicle enter node. All right, so in my vehicles category, you see I have an enter node, simple enough. And the last node I'm going to need is an AI follow path node. All right, so I think I have all the nodes that we need. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is from the beginning of the game, I'm going to sync up the output of game start to sync on vehicle enter. And now I need to work with this entity ID node. So the entity ID, like I said, is a placeholder for the ID of the car. So I'm going to click on my car in the viewport, and then on this entity ID node, I'm going to right click and assign selected entity. All right, and you can see it has now built the entity of this vehicle into that node. So now it's very easy for me to drag this ID arrow from here up to vehicle ID on vehicle enter. So instead of having to plug in the ID of the vehicle, which would have been difficult, I can use this entity ID node to send the ID wherever I want it. That's going to be helpful again in a minute. All right, so the vehicle enter node needs an entity, and that's going to be our AI because the AI is performing the action. I'm going to go ahead and select our AI in the viewport. And I'll right click on vehicle enter and I will assign selected entity. All right. One important thing on the vehicle enter node that you can't forget is that you have to assign a seat for the AI to enter. So right now, you can see over in our options over here, the seat says none. But if we click on this and bring it down, we get a few options. And one of them is driver. And if you want them to be driving, that's probably the seat you want them in. So we'll go ahead and tell them to get in the driver's seat. Another thing that you sometimes need on this, depending on the AI you're using and depending on the vehicle you're using, is you might have to check this fast box so that they will immediately jump up and get in the vehicle. Otherwise, sometimes they'll kind of hover around the vehicle for a while, do some of their AI scripting, and it gets all messed up. So as a pretty good rule of thumb, I usually check this fast box. All right, so the next one that we need to plug in is this AI follow path node. So upon succeeding the vehicle enter, I'm going to drag a little arrow from that down and sync with the follow path node. So the follow path node wants a couple of things. It needs an entity and it needs a path. So to me, common logic would say that the entity for this follow path node would be the AI character. But it's actually going to be the vehicle that the AI character is driving. So over here, since I already have this entity ID node, I can go ahead and drag this ID arrow to sync with the entity for that follow path node. So you can see that that entity ID box has become very useful because I've been able to save myself some trouble of entering two different IDs, and I was just able to plug it into those two different places. So I think the last thing we need is to plug in a path. So we created our AI path, and it auto-named itself to AI Path 1. I'm going to go ahead and type that name in here, AI Path 1. And as a good rule of thumb, it's usually easier if you have multiple paths and things that are hard to remember, it's usually easier to name your paths, something easy to type in, because these are case sensitive and it's very easy to mess it up. And I've had some very frustrating moments with that. All right, with all that plugged in, I think we're ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and move my flow graph to the side, and we'll select our AI physics button and see what happens. All right, he enters, drives the vehicle, and has a horrifying wreck, which means he followed the path pretty well. All right, I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. So with that, I'll close.